The Persian Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the border of India to the shores of Egypt, housing more than 40 million people under a single crown. Most people know it only from the edges of Bible stories. A king who issues a decree, a Jewish queen who saves her people, a city where the exiles live far from home. But almost nobody asks what life actually looked like inside this empire, what it smelled like, what it cost to survive in it, and what it meant to be one of the ordinary millions who built, fed, and maintained the most powerful civilization of the ancient world. That is what this documentary reconstructs. And by the time it is finished, the books of Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel will never read the same way again. In 550 BCE, a Persian king from the region of Anshan in southwestern Iran did something no one in the ancient world had managed before. Cyrus II, later called Cyrus the Great, began a campaign of conquest that within 20 years would absorb the Median Empire to his north, the Lydian Empire to his west, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire to his south and west. No previous ruler had consolidated this much territory this quickly. The speed of it stunned contemporary observers. Greek writers, Babylonian priests, and Jewish prophets all struggled to explain what they were witnessing. The fall of Babylon in 539 BCE was the moment that changed everything for the people of the Bible. Babylon in the 6th century BCE was not simply a city, it was the cultural, commercial, and religious capital of the ancient world. Its walls, according to Herodotus, were 56 miles in circumference and wide enough for 2 four-horse chariots to pass each other on top. Its population has been estimated by modern archaeologists at somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people, and living within and around it, integrated into its economy and its neighborhoods for 2 generations, were the Jewish exile communities that the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had deported from Judah beginning in 605 BCE. When Cyrus walked into Babylon, the Cyrus Cylinder records that the city opened its gates to him without battle, and the Babylonian Chronicle confirms this. He inherited not just a city, but the entire population of the ancient Near East's exile communities, including the Jews. The empire that resulted from his conquests was, by any metric, extraordinary. Under Darius I, who ruled from 522 to 486 BCE, the Achaemenid Persian Empire covered roughly 5.5 million square kilometers. That is larger than the continental United States. It stretched from the Aegean coast of modern Turkey to the Indus River Valley in modern Pakistan, from the steppes above the Black Sea to the first cataracts of the Nile in southern Egypt. Inside its borders lived people speaking dozens of languages: Old Persian, Elamite, Aramaic, Babylonian, Lydian, Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, Bactrian, and many others. Dozens of distinct religions were practiced within the empire's boundaries, from the fire temples of Zoroastrian Persia to the great temple complexes of Babylon and Egypt to the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. The empire administered itself through 4 rotating royal capitals, each serving a different function and different season. Ecbatana, in the Zagros Mountains of modern western Iran, served as the summer capital. At an elevation of roughly 1,800 meters, its climate provided relief from the brutal lowland heat. Excavations at Ecbatana, modern Hamadan, have revealed traces of the royal complex that ancient sources describe as spectacular, with silver and gold decorating its walls. Persepolis, in the Persian heartland, was the ceremonial capital, used especially for the great spring festival of Nowruz, when tribute delegations from across the empire arrived to present gifts and confirm their loyalty to the king. The platform at Persepolis covered roughly 125,000 square meters. Babylon remained an administrative hub in Mesopotamia, drawing on the ancient city's infrastructure and the expertise of its scribal and administrative traditions. And Susa, in the flat lowlands of the Khuzestan plain, ancient Elam, served as the winter capital and the beating heart of the empire's daily bureaucracy. It is in Susa that the biblical world and the Persian world intersect most directly. Nehemiah was serving at the Persian court in Susa when the news arrived about Jerusalem's broken walls. Esther entered the harem of a Persian king in Susa. Daniel's later visions unfold in and around Susa. Ezra's mission was authorized from Susa, the city that most readers of the Bible picture only vaguely. A distant eastern place, somehow exotic and powerful, was a real, excavated, archaeologically documented city whose ruins lie in southwestern Iran today. To understand the biblical world of the Persian period, you have to understand Susa. And to understand Susa, you have to walk into it. But first, before we enter the city, we need to understand the scale of what produced it. The tribute procession reliefs carved into the staircase walls at Persepolis are among the most extraordinary images that have survived from the ancient world. 23 delegations, carved in precise detail, ascend the staircase in 2 parallel lines, each delegation clearly identified by their distinctive clothing, hairstyles, footwear, and the specific gifts they carry. Lydians bringing bracelets and bowls, Babylonians leading a humped bull, Armenians carrying a horse, Ethiopians with an okapi and elephant tusks, Indians with axes, Bactrians with a camel, Arabians with bundles of fabric, Scythians in their distinctive pointed caps. Each delegation is separated from the next by a carved cypress tree, the tree of Persia, and each is led by a Persian usher guiding the visitors toward the king. These carvings were not decorative. They were a visual argument, expressed in stone, about the nature of the world and who occupied its center. The message was not simply that these peoples paid tribute to Persia. The message was that this was the natural, even divinely ordered arrangement of humanity. The empire at the center, the nations at the periphery, the king at the apex of all of it, and the king's beneficence flowing outward to every corner of the earth, in return for every corner of the earth's tribute flowing inward. The Persepolis reliefs are the Persian Empire's visual theology of power, carved into stone so that it would outlast the individual kings who commissioned it. The empire's size made all of this possible. 5.5 million square kilometers meant that within a single political structure, you could find the agricultural wealth of the Nile Delta, the pastoral wealth of the Central Asian steppes, the mineral wealth of the gold deposits in Bactria and Lydia, the maritime wealth of the Phoenician coast, the commercial wealth of Babylon's trading networks, and the agricultural surplus of Mesopotamia's irrigated river valleys. No previous empire had aggregated resources on this scale. The Persian treasury at Persepolis became, over time, one of the great accumulations of wealth in the ancient world. Alexander the Great found roughly 180,000 talents of silver there when he took the city in 330 BCE, an amount so large that it required 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels to carry it away. This is the empire inside which the books of Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah unfold. Not a metaphor, not a backdrop, a specific, enormous, administratively sophisticated, archaeologically documented political structure that shaped every aspect of daily life for the people living inside it. Coming into Susa from the flat Khuzestan plain, a traveler in the 5th century BCE would have seen the palace rising long before arriving at the city's outer walls. Persian kings had rebuilt Susa extensively beginning under Darius I, transforming an already ancient city. Susa had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years before the Achaemenid period, into one of the most impressive royal centers in the ancient world. The palace complex was constructed on a massive artificial terrace of mud brick, raised approximately 12 meters above the surrounding terrain. From a distance of several miles, the terrace and the tall columns of the Apadana, the great audience hall, would have been visible as a landmark rising above the flat plain. Darius I left an inscription describing the construction of his palace at Susa, and it is worth pausing on this document because it is extraordinary. The inscription records, in Darius's own words, where each material in the palace came from. Cedar timber was brought from Lebanon. Precious wood called yakka came from Gandhara and Carmania. Gold came from Sardis in Lydia and from Bactria in what is now Afghanistan. Lapis lazuli and carnelian came from Sogdiana in modern Uzbekistan. Turquoise came from Chorasmia. Silver and ebony came from Egypt. Ornamentation from Ionia. Stone columns from a village in Elam. Goldsmiths from Media and Egypt. Woodworkers from Sardis and Egypt. And the men who worked the baked brick were Babylonians. This single inscription is itself a map of the empire. Every material, every specialist, every craft tradition was drawn towards Susa from the farthest corners of Persian authority. The palace was not merely a building, it was a physical demonstration that the entire known world paid tribute here. The Apadana's 72 columns each stood approximately 20 meters tall. The hall they supported could accommodate thousands of people simultaneously. Greek visitors who saw it wrote about it in terms that struggle to contain what they observed. Persepolis's Apadana, though more famous today because of its carved relief processions showing tribute bearers from every corner of the empire, was built on the same model as Susa's. Both were designed to reduce every visitor to the proper psychological scale, very small, standing in the presence of something very large. But the palace was only the beginning of Susa. Below the royal terrace, the city spread across multiple districts in the flat terrain. Archaeologists working at the site over the past century and a half have identified distinct areas: the fortified royal precinct on its terrace, and spreading out from it, the residential and craft quarters where ordinary life operated. These areas have yielded the kinds of evidence that document daily existence: pottery, grinding stones, clay lamps, textile implements, administrative seals, and in some areas, traces of the mud brick housing that formed the fabric of ordinary urban life. The streets of the residential districts were narrow, typically 2 to 4 meters wide, flanked by the blank exterior walls of mud brick houses. Entrances from the street were small and easily controlled. The interior life of the city happened behind those walls, in the courtyards and rooms that opened inward, away from the dust and noise of the street. At the same time, the streets were constantly busy. Workers moving between assignments, merchants carrying goods, water carriers transporting clay jars from the river, donkeys loaded with agricultural produce from the surrounding countryside. In summer, the temperature in Susa regularly exceeds 40 degrees Celsius. 45 is not uncommon. The physical experience of moving through the city during the summer months would have been one of sustained heat, the mud brick walls radiating warmth, the air itself heavy and still, the relief of shade beneath awnings or inside the narrow alleys between buildings a constant preoccupation. The Persian architectural response to this climate, thick walls, small high windows, interior courtyards, was not accidental. It was the accumulated solution of thousands of years of people trying to stay cool in one of the hottest inhabited environments in the ancient world. The smells of the city would have been distinctive in ways that modern visitors to reconstructed ancient sites rarely anticipate. Animal dung from donkeys and livestock, the smoke of cooking fires burning dung and charcoal, the fermentation smell of beer production, baking bread, dried fish, spices carried by merchants from India and the Arabian Peninsula, and underneath all of it, the faint mineral smell of the river that ran nearby, and the particular dry dustiness of mud brick ground to powder by foot traffic. It was into this city, this specific, sensory, demanding physical environment, that Nehemiah's news from Jerusalem arrived. And it was from this city that the story of Esther unfolded. But here is the detail almost nobody mentions when they talk about Susa. The people moving through those streets were not primarily Persians. They were not primarily any single nationality. Susa, under the Achaemenids, was one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the ancient world, drawing workers, merchants, administrators, and soldiers from every corner of the empire. To walk through Susa's markets in 480 BCE was to hear Aramaic and Babylonian and Elamite and Persian and Greek, and possibly Hebrew, spoken within the space of a single street. The city was, in other words, the ancient world at its most cosmopolitan, and most of the people living in it were far from home. Now watch what happens when the archaeology gets specific. In 1933, a team of archaeologists excavating the ruins of Persepolis in the Fars region of modern Iran made a discovery that would take decades to fully comprehend. Inside a sealed fortification wall, they found thousands of clay tablets, administrative records from the Persian royal administration, written in the Elamite language, dating primarily to the period between 509 and 494 BCE. These are the Persepolis fortification tablets, and they are one of the most important archives ever recovered from the ancient world. Roughly 15,000 tablets survive in readable or partially readable condition. The archive is currently split between the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago and the National Museum of Iran, the result of a loan that became entangled in decades of political upheaval. Scholars have been studying and publishing these tablets for nearly a century, and the picture they reveal of daily life inside the Persian Empire is precise in ways that almost no other ancient source can match. The tablets are ration records. Every worker who received a food or drink allocation from the Persian royal administration was recorded. The records specify the worker's name, their nationality or regional origin, their occupation, and the precise amount of barley, wine, beer, dates, or livestock they received during the covered period. The tablets cover workers across the Persian heartland, the region around Persepolis and Susa, and the routes connecting them, and the picture they construct is of an empire that ran on documented, allocated, monitored labor. Workers from more than 20 different nationalities appear in the tablets. Persians, obviously, Medes, Elamites, Babylonians, Egyptians, Lydians, Bactrians, Indians, Scudrians, Arabians, and Judeans. The Elamite term used in the tablets for people of Judean origin is a phonetic rendering of the Hebrew word for Judah. These are Jewish workers living and laboring inside the Persian royal administrative system, drawing their daily rations from the same clay tablet records that document workers from across the empire. They had names. Some of those names have survived. But the tablets reveal something else that is genuinely surprising about the Persian labor system. Women appear throughout the archive in substantial numbers, documented as workers receiving their own ration allocations. Female stoneworkers, female grain processors, female textile workers, and in a significant number of cases, these women received rations that were comparable to those of men performing similar tasks. This does not mean the ancient world was an egalitarian paradise. It was not, but it does mean that the common assumption that women in the ancient world were economically invisible, their work unrecorded and uncounted, is demonstrably wrong when applied to the Persian administrative system. The tablets counted these women because the empire needed their labor and was paying for it in rations, and the administrative machinery recorded what the administrative machinery allocated. The base ration for an unskilled laborer in this system was approximately 10 quarts of barley per month. This is not a comfortable margin. 10 quarts of barley, milled and baked, produces roughly enough bread to sustain a person at a maintenance-level caloric intake, assuming the person also had access to supplementary food. Skilled craftsmen received more, sometimes 2 to 3 times the base laborer's allocation, depending on specialization and seniority. Supervisory workers and administrative personnel received more still. At the top of the ration hierarchy, individuals close to the royal administration might receive allocations in wine and high-quality grain that represented genuine material comfort compared to the laborer's 10 quarts. The empire documented all of it, every allocation, every name, every jar of beer distributed to a group of stoneworkers on a Tuesday in 501 BCE. That level of administrative precision tells you something important about how the Persian Empire functioned. This was not a casual or improvised system. This was a civilization that understood bureaucratic documentation as a tool of control and resource management, and that deployed that tool consistently across thousands of kilometers and dozens of nationalities. The same civilization that produced the Cyrus cylinder and built the Persepolis Apadana and issued the decree that brought the Jewish exiles home also counted every quart of grain it gave to every laborer in its workforce. So what did those workers actually eat? Barley was the foundation of the diet at almost every social level below the royal court. The tablets make this unambiguous. Barley was nutritionally dense, storable, and adaptable. It could be milled into flour, baked into bread, or fermented into beer, and these three uses covered the vast majority of caloric intake for ordinary people across the empire. The process of turning barley into bread began with the grinding stone. Grinding stones, a heavy saddle-shaped lower stone and a smaller handheld upper stone, have been recovered from domestic archaeological contexts across the entire Persian Empire. A woman grinding grain would kneel or sit behind the lower stone, push the upper stone forward across the grain, and repeat the motion until the grain was reduced to flour. This was daily work, often performed in the early morning before other household tasks began. The sound of grinding stones, a rhythmic, sustained scraping, was one of the defining sounds of ancient domestic life, mentioned in the book of Jeremiah as a marker of normal daily existence, and its absence mentioned as a sign of desolation. The flour was mixed with water, possibly with some fermentation agent, and formed into flat rounds that were baked on the outside of a clay oven or on flat stones placed over an open fire. The resulting bread was dense, slightly sour, and dark. It was nutritious in the way that whole grain staple foods are nutritious, and it was filling, but it was not varied. The laborer who ate it every day, at every meal, because there was not much else at the base level of the ration system. Beer, however, was. This is the part that often surprises modern readers. Beer in the ancient world was not primarily a recreational beverage. It was a caloric supplement, a source of hydration in environments where water quality was variable and sometimes dangerous, and a fermentation preservation that allowed grain to be consumed in liquid form weeks or months after it would otherwise have spoiled. The fermentation process also made beer slightly less likely to harbor the waterborne pathogens that could make untreated water a source of illness. In an era without modern water treatment, this mattered. The Persepolis fortification tablets distinguish between multiple grades of beer: ordinary beer for general distribution to the laborer population, stronger or higher quality beer for skilled workers, and the best grades for administrative and court personnel. The distribution of beer to workers was not a bonus or a reward. It was a standard component of the ration, allocated regularly and recorded meticulously alongside the barley allocation. Dates provided the concentrated sugar that the diet otherwise largely lacked. Date palm cultivation was extensive across Mesopotamia and Elam, the flat lowland territories that formed much of the empire's agricultural heartland. Dates could be eaten fresh in season, or dried and pressed into blocks that could be stored and transported with minimal deterioration. For workers in the field and the quarry, dried dates were an efficient portable energy source. The sweetness they provided was not incidental. In a diet dominated by the savory and the starchy, sweetness was a significant sensory and nutritional contribution. Figs served a similar function in the more Western and Mediterranean-adjacent parts of the empire. Meat appeared at Persian tables across the social spectrum, but in quantities that depended sharply on social position. Ordinary laborers received small periodic meat allocations, usually mutton or goat, rather than daily provisions. The tablets document meat appearing in ration records as occasional rather than constant allocations for the general workforce. The Persian royal table operated in a completely different register. Herodotus, who gathered information about Persian court life from Greek sources with direct knowledge, records that the Persian king's daily table required 400 sheep, in addition to horses, oxen, deer, geese, and various other animals. Modern historians are careful to note that this provision fed an entire court complex, not a single individual's meal. The royal kitchen served the king's extended household, his officials, his guards, and the retinue of attendants required to maintain the palace operation. But even accounting for this, the scale is striking. The same empire that measured out 10 quarts of barley per month to its unskilled workers, operated a royal dining operation that slaughtered hundreds of large animals per day. Xenophon, who had direct experience of Persian court culture and wrote about it in detail, is explicit that the royal table was a deliberate political theatre. The abundance of the king's table demonstrated the abundance of the empire. The variety and quantity of what the king could serve expressed the reach and power of the authority under which that food had been gathered. To dine at the Persian king's table, or even to receive a portion from it, which was a documented form of royal favor, was to participate in a ritual affirmation of imperial supremacy. The wine culture of the Persian court deserves a specific mention. Herodotus reports that the Persians made their most important decisions twice, once while drunk on wine, and once sober, and that if the two decisions agreed, the matter proceeded. Whether this observation is literally accurate or a Greek exaggeration of Persian drinking customs, it captures something real about the social role of wine in Persian court culture. Wine was a prestige commodity. The Persepolis tablets distinguish between different grades and origins of wine, documenting its allocation to court personnel of various ranks. Wines from specific regions were understood to be of superior quality. Wine from certain areas of Elam or from imported Greek amphoras commanded higher status than locally produced ordinary wine. For ordinary workers, the wine allocation in the Persepolis tablets was real, but modest. The beer allocation was more consistently generous. Beer was the everyday beverage, wine the periodic supplement. Both served as caloric supplements to the grain ration, and both were distributed systematically rather than irregularly. The cooking practices of ordinary Persian households centered on the clay oven and the open fire. A typical household cooking setup involved either a clay oven, a cylindrical vessel set into the ground, or built up from the ground, heated from inside with burning fuel, with flatbreads plastered to the interior walls to bake, or a simpler arrangement of 3 stones supporting a clay cooking pot over an open fire in the courtyard. The 3-stone fireplace has been used continuously across the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, from the ancient world to the present day. The fuel was typically dried animal dung, collected and stored, supplemented by whatever wood or charcoal was available. Dung fuel burned hot and relatively smokeless. It was the practical and affordable fuel for families who did not have access to forest resources. The smell of a Persian residential quarter in the early morning would have been defined by these cooking fires. The particular smell of dung burning, the smell of barley flour mixed with water and beginning to bake, the slightly yeasty smell of beer being strained from its sediment into serving vessels, the smoke rising from dozens of courtyards simultaneously as families across the neighborhood began their day. The contrast between these two tables is the clearest single image of Persian social stratification. 10 quarts of barley and a jar of ordinary beer, 400 sheep per day, and wine from the far corners of the world. Both tables existed inside the same administrative system. Both were documented by the same clay tablets, and the distance between them, in material comfort, in social power, in access to the full sensory experience of the ancient world, was the distance that defined the Persian social hierarchy. Move away from the palace precinct in Susa, and you enter a different world almost immediately. The residential quarters of the city, the areas where ordinary workers, craftsmen, merchants, and lower-level administrators lived, were organized on a mud-brick grid that reflected centuries of accumulated construction, demolition, and rebuilding on the same plots of land. Susa had been inhabited for thousands of years before the Achaemenids arrived. The urban fabric of the residential districts was old in the way that only Near Eastern cities can be old, not built at one time according to a single plan, but accumulated over generations, each building incorporating the leveled remains of what had stood there before. Ordinary Persian houses across the empire followed a consistent architectural logic: mud brick construction, interior courtyard organization, flat roofs used as additional living surfaces. The mud brick itself was made from a mixture of mud, straw, and in some cases animal dung, pressed into wooden molds and dried in the sun. Sun-dried mud brick, as opposed to kiln-fired brick, which required more fuel and effort, was the standard construction material for ordinary buildings across the ancient Near East. It was cheap, abundant, and effective. Its thermal mass properties made it genuinely good at moderating temperature. Thick mud brick walls absorbed heat slowly during the day and released it slowly at night, reducing the extreme temperature swings that made the Khuzestan plains climate so challenging. A middle-status house in a Persian urban area typically had an entrance room or vestibule facing the street, which opened into the central courtyard. The courtyard was the heart of the house. It provided natural light to the rooms arranged around it, allowed air to circulate through the interior of the building, and served as the primary outdoor living space for the household. Cooking fires burned in the courtyard or in a small kitchen room adjacent to it, and the smell of cooking was a constant presence in the residential quarters of any Persian city. Around the courtyard, accessed through doorways rather than windows, were the sleeping rooms, storage areas, and any specialized workspaces the household required. The flat roof was reached by an exterior staircase attached to the courtyard wall. In the summer months, when sleeping inside meant sleeping in rooms that had absorbed the day's heat, families moved their sleeping arrangements to the roof, cooler by night, open to whatever breeze was available, and with a view of the sky that the narrow streets below did not offer. Exterior walls facing the street were typically blank below the roofline, no ground floor windows, no visual connection between the interior life of the house and the public life of the street. This was not merely a security measure, though it was partly that. It reflected a fundamental cultural organization of space into public and private spheres. The street was the world's territory, the courtyard was the family's. Excavations at sites across the Persian heartland have recovered the material culture of these households in detail. Grinding stones appear in almost every domestic context. The heavy lower stones worn smooth by decades of daily use, the smaller upper stones shaped to fit the hand. Clay oil lamps, small, hand-pinched vessels with a wick opening at one end and a reservoir for sesame or olive oil at the other, provided the only artificial light in rooms with no windows. Their light was modest, enough to work by if you were close to the flame, enough to navigate a room, but casting most of the interior into deep shadow. The evenings inside a Persian household were considerably darker than modern people typically imagine ancient domestic life to have been. Ceramic vessels of many sizes and shapes handled water storage, food preparation and serving. Large storage jars, called pithoi, were often sunk partially into the floor of storage rooms to keep their contents cool. Cooking pots sat directly over fires. Smaller vessels held oil, wine, and preserved foods. The household potter, or the market potter who supplied the neighborhood, produced these vessels in large numbers, and the sherds from broken pots form one of the most abundant categories of archaeological evidence at any ancient Near Eastern site. Spindle whorls, the small perforated weights used to spin thread from raw wool or flax, appear in enormous quantities at domestic sites throughout the Persian Empire. Textile production was not peripheral to the household economy, it was central to it. Wool from sheep, linen from flax, and in wealthier contexts cotton from India or silk from Central Asian trade networks, were all processed at the household level. The sound of a loom, the rhythmic thud of the beater pushing threads together, would have been as characteristic a sound of the Persian residential quarter as the grinding stone or the fire. The Persepolis fortification tablets document organized textile production at the royal level, recording large numbers of female workers in textile shops receiving rations for their work. But the tablets also reflect the reality that textile production was happening at every level of the economy, from the royal workshops to the household courtyard, and that the skills required to produce cloth were among the most economically significant competencies an ordinary Persian woman possessed. The rhythm of a Persian household's day was organized around the available light. At dawn, When the flat rooftop turned from black to grey to pale orange as the sun came up over the plain, the household stirred. The grinding stone was often the first sound. Grain needed to be processed early enough that bread would be ready before the working day's demands consumed the morning hours. Water needed to be fetched, from a well, from a public water source, or in the larger cities, from channels that diverted river water into the residential districts. Children old enough to carry things would have been tasked with water carrying. The older members of the household directed the morning's food production. The men prepared to leave for the day's work. The women organized the domestic economy. By mid-morning, the household's working pattern had established itself. One or more women tending the cooking fire and managing food preparation, others spinning or weaving, others engaged in the maintenance work that any household requires, cleaning, repairing, organizing stored goods. The courtyard was the center of all of it, with women moving between the kitchen, the weaving area, and the storage rooms in a pattern that was simultaneously domestic routine and economic production. The clay lamp was a constant presence. The small hand-pinched oil lamps recovered from Persian domestic sites were simple objects, a flattened oval of clay, pinched at one end to form a spout for the wick, with a shallow depression for the oil reservoir. Sesame oil or olive oil, whichever was available and affordable, filled the reservoir. The wick was a twist of linen or plant fiber. The lamp's light was modest, a small yellow flame, casting perhaps a meter of useful light in any direction, sufficient for close work and for navigating a familiar room, but producing little more than darkness with a center in any space larger than a small room. In the evening, after the working day ended and the household gathered for its meal, the lamp lit the courtyard where the family ate. In the warm months, the meal happened in the open air of the courtyard. In the cold months, it happened in the most insulated room of the house, huddled close to whatever heat the cooking fire still provided. After the meal, the household moved towards sleep, the older members to the sleeping rooms, the younger perhaps to the roof in summer, everyone retiring when the lamp oil ran low or was conserved for the next morning's work. This was the daily architecture of ordinary Persian life. Not romantic, not particularly comfortable by modern standards, but ordered, purposeful, and adapted with considerable sophistication to the demands of the environment. When families left their homes and entered the city, the infrastructure they encountered was part of a system whose scale modern people rarely appreciate. The Persian Royal Road is the most famous element of that infrastructure, and it deserves the attention it receives. Herodotus describes it in the 5th book of his Histories, a road of approximately 450 parasangs, roughly 1,677 miles, running from Susa to Sardis in western Anatolia. Along its length, the Persian crown maintained a series of post stations at intervals of approximately 15 to 25 miles. Each station was equipped with fresh horses, grooms, and the royal couriers who carried messages and official communications along the road's entire length. Herodotus makes an observation that has remained one of the most memorable sentences in ancient historical writing. Nothing in the world travels as fast as these Persian couriers. He then quotes the Greek principle inscribed on the Athenian postal system, later adapted for the United States Postal Service's headquarters in New York, that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their designated stages with utmost speed. A royal courier changing horses at each post station could cover the entire 1,677 miles in approximately 7 days. An ordinary traveler covering the same distance on foot would take about 90 days. A merchant caravan traveling with loaded pack animals might take 3 to 4 months. The speed differential between official royal communication and ordinary civilian travel was a function of infrastructure investment, and that investment was deliberate. An empire of 5.5 million square kilometers could not be governed if news took months to move from its edges to its center. The road itself was maintained as a physical surface, not a paved road in the Roman sense, but a cleared, graded route whose obstructions were removed and whose difficult terrain features had been managed to allow consistent traffic. Along its length, travelers encountered royal inspection posts where they were required to present documentation authorizing their travel. Moving through the empire without proper letters was not merely inconvenient, it was potentially dangerous. The empire's control of movement was part of its control of everything else. At the commercial level, this infrastructure supported a trade network of extraordinary diversity. The markets of Susa in the 5th century BCE would have offered goods from across the ancient world. Black pepper and cardamom from India, traded through the Persian Gulf route or overland through Bactria. Cinnamon and cassia from southern Arabia and ultimately from Southeast Asia, moving through the trading networks that connected the Indian Ocean world to the Persian heartland. Fine linen from Egypt, woven in a distinctive style that the ancient world recognized immediately as Egyptian. Wool textiles in crimson and purple dyes, the purple coming from the murex shellfish processed along the Phoenician coast, the crimson from the kermes insect cultivated in Anatolia and Greece. Metalwork from workshops in Sardis and Babylon, glassware from the Levantine coast, ivory from Africa and India, dried fish from the Mediterranean, packed in amphorae and transported hundreds of miles inland. Stand in the market district of Susa on a busy morning, and the sensory experience would have been overwhelming. The sound, animal sounds from the livestock section where merchants sold sheep, goats, and chickens, the rhythmic hammer of a metalworker shaping bronze, the raised voices of merchants calling the quality of their wares in multiple languages, the creak of cartwheels on the packed earth road surface, the babble of Aramaic, Persian, Babylonian, Elamite, and Greek overlapping and threading through each other in the narrow market street. The smell, spices piled in open sacks and clay vessels, releasing their concentrated fragrance into the warm air, animal dung and animal bodies, fresh baked bread from a vendor near the market entrance, fish sauce and preserved fish in sealed amphorae, the sharp mineral smell of freshly worked metal, the dusty smell of dried grain, the heavy sweetness of dates and dried figs in their storage baskets. The visual density, stalls stacked high with goods, merchants calling from every direction, customers examining cloth for quality, examining grain for purity, examining metalwork for finish, water sellers moving through the crowd with clay jars balanced on their heads, scribes positioned at the market's edges, ready to write contracts for those who could not write their own. The contrast between a dusty camel driver from the eastern trade routes and a Lydian merchant in fine wool examining the same bolt of Indian cotton from opposite sides. This was the city that Nehemiah left when he saddled his horse and departed for Jerusalem. The commercial language that connected all of these traders was Aramaic. This is a point that is essential to understanding the biblical texts of the Persian period. Aramaic was not the official language of the Persian court. That was Old Persian. But it was the language that the empire's administrative and commercial machinery ran on at every level below the royal inscriptions. Aramaic was the language of contracts, of letters, of trade negotiations, of administrative communications between satrapies and the royal centre. It was understood across the entire empire, from Egypt to Bactria, by merchants, scribes, administrators, and anyone whose work required written communication beyond their own local language. The books of Ezra and Daniel contain substantial sections written in Aramaic rather than Hebrew. This has sometimes puzzled readers who expect the Bible to be written entirely in Hebrew or Greek. But the Aramaic sections make immediate sense once you understand that Aramaic was the language of Persian administrative life, the language in which Ezra's commission from Artaxerxes was written, the language in which official Persian documents circulated, the language that Jews living inside the Persian administrative system used for official communication. The Bible preserves that historical reality in its own text. The administrative machinery that made the market and the road and the ration record work was the satrapial system, and understanding it is essential to understanding almost everything that happens in the Persian period biblical texts. The empire was divided into satrapies, administrative provinces, numbering roughly 20 to 30 at various points in the empire's history, depending on how subdivisions were counted and mapped. Each satrapy was governed by a satrap. The position was typically held by a Persian nobleman, often a member of the royal family or closely connected to it, appointed directly by the king. The satrap was simultaneously the empire's tax collector, its judge, its military commander, and its representative of royal authority within the province. The concentration of power in a single individual, governing a vast territory, was a structural vulnerability that the Persian kings recognized and attempted to manage. Their solution was the parallel oversight mechanism, royal inspectors, described in Greek sources as the eyes and ears of the king, who traveled independently through the empire's satrapies, monitored satrapal performance, investigated complaints, and reported directly to the king without going through the satrap's own communication channels. These inspectors, whose title also appears in some Persian administrative documents, were the empire's internal accountability mechanism. A satrap who was being too aggressive in his tax collection, enriching himself at the empire's expense, or planning a rebellion needed to worry not only about the king's response, but about when the next royal inspector might arrive. The system worked imperfectly, as all administrative systems do. Persian history includes multiple satrapal revolts and cases of satrapal corruption, but it worked well enough to sustain the world's largest empire for more than 2 centuries. Herodotus preserves a detailed list of the tribute obligations that Darius I imposed on each satrapy, and the numbers are substantial. Babylon, the richest satrapy in Mesopotamia, paid an annual tribute of 1,000 talents of silver, plus enough grain to feed the Persian army stationed there for 4 months of the year. Egypt paid 700 talents of silver, plus substantial grain. The smaller, or more distant satrapies paid less, but every satrapy paid. The total annual income flowing into the Persian royal treasury, according to Herodotus, amounted to roughly 14,500 euboic talents of silver per year, an enormous sum that financed the palace construction projects, the military campaigns, the road system, the royal court's daily operation, and all the other expressions of imperial power that the empire maintained simultaneously. At the local level, Persian law operated through a system of documented contracts, clay tablets recording transactions, property sales, rental agreements, loans with interest rates, marriage contracts, business partnerships, have been recovered from sites across the empire's Babylonian territories in large numbers. These documents were written in Babylonian cuneiform, using the ancient scribal tradition that Babylonian civilization had maintained for thousands of years before the Persian conquest. The Persian administrative system did not replace these local legal traditions, it incorporated them. Subject peoples could continue to use their own legal forms, their own scribal conventions, and their own contract languages, as long as the contracts were properly witnessed and sealed. Authentication was by seal, a cylinder seal, or stamp seal, pressed into the wet clay of the tablet before it dried, leaving an impression that identified the party and made the document difficult to falsify. Both parties to a transaction typically kept their own copy of the clay tablet, sometimes with a sealed clay envelope enclosing the tablet itself. The envelope bore a summary of the document's content. If a dispute arose about whether the tablet had been tampered with, the envelope could be broken open and the enclosed tablet read. This is the legal and administrative world in which Nehemiah operated. But before we follow Nehemiah to that moment, we need to understand what ordinary legal life looked like for the millions of people who were not royal cupbearers. For an ordinary farmer in a Persian satrapy, the law was primarily experienced through contracts and through disputes about contracts. The clay tablet contract was the foundation of personal economic security. If you lent money to a neighbor and expected it back with interest, you needed a contract. If you sold your grain surplus to a merchant, You needed a contract specifying the price, the quantity, and the terms of delivery. If you agreed to rent a plot of farmland for 3 years, you needed a contract describing the land, the rent, the obligations of each party, and what happened if the harvest failed. Scribes who could write these contracts operated throughout Persian urban centers, and in agricultural villages, local elites with scribal training served the same function. The scribe's fee was a cost of doing business, and the clay tablet, with its impressed seals, was the insurance policy that made commerce possible between strangers who had no pre-existing relationship of trust. Debt law was the most practically consequential aspect of the legal system for ordinary people. Persian period, Babylonian debt contracts routinely specified interest rates, typically somewhere between 20 and 33% per year on silver loans and 60% per year on grain loans. These rates seem extraordinarily high by modern standards, but they reflect the risk environment of agricultural credit in the ancient world, where a drought, a locust plague, or a military requisition could wipe out an entire season's harvest. The lender who charged 30% annually was pricing the real probability that the borrower's crop would fail and the loan would never be repaid. The consequences of debt default were serious. A borrower who could not repay could be forced to surrender property, land, livestock, stored grain. A borrower with no property could be required to surrender the labor of family members to the creditor, working off the debt over time. This was the institution of debt bondage, and it was a standard feature of the Persian period legal landscape across Mesopotamia and Judah. It is this specific institution that appears in Nehemiah 5, when community members complain to Nehemiah that they have mortgaged their fields and vineyards to buy food, that they are taking loans at interest to pay Persian taxes, and that some families are selling their children into debt bondage because they cannot meet their obligations. We are forcing our sons and our daughters to be slaves, the text records, and some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but it is not in our power to help it, for other men have our fields and our vineyards. The economics Nehemiah confronts are not a literary invention. They are the documented normal operation of Persian period debt law, applied in a Jewish community rebuilding its social order. When Nehemiah, standing before King Artaxerxes in Susa, asked for letters authorizing his travel to Jerusalem, he was requesting documents within a well-understood Persian administrative framework. Official travel through the empire's satrapies without such documentation was both practically difficult. Post-station keepers and satrapal officials were trained to ask for papers, and potentially dangerous in territories where the traveler was unknown. The letters Nehemiah received from Artaxerxes were not a personal favor. They were standard administrative instruments, and their authority was real precisely because they were standard. The governor of the province beyond the river knew exactly what those letters meant and what the consequences of defying them would be. When Artaxerxes also provided a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, ordering him to supply timber for Jerusalem's rebuilding, he was exercising royal patronage, the documented Persian practice of directing royal resources toward projects the king had approved. Persian administrative records document many such allocations, the king directing provincial resources toward temples, construction projects, and other undertakings that the crown had decided to support. Nehemiah's timber allocation was unusual in its target. A rebuilt Jerusalem was an outlier in terms of typical Persian patronage, but the mechanism was entirely normal. The administrative machinery of the empire was, in other words, precisely the machinery that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah describe. Now here is where the story of this empire opens into something much larger. The official religion of the Persian Empire was Zoroastrianism, and its implications for the biblical world are far deeper than most people realize. Zoroastrianism was founded by the prophet Zarathustra, whose dates remain debated, with serious proposals ranging from the early 2nd millennium BCE to the 7th century BCE. By the Achaemenid period, Zoroastrian theology was the dominant religious framework of the Persian ruling class, and the royal inscriptions make this explicit. At Behistun, the great carved rock inscription where Darius I commemorates his first year of rule, the text begins, "A great God is Ahura Mazda, who created this earth, who created that sky, who created mankind, who created happiness for mankind, who made Darius king." At Persepolis, inscription after inscription names Ahura Mazda as the source of the king's authority and the foundation of the cosmic order that the king's rule maintains. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, was the supreme deity of Zoroastrian theology, the principle of good, truth, and light. Opposing him was Angra Mainyu, the hostile spirit, the principle of evil, deception, and darkness. The cosmos was understood as a theater of this conflict, unfolding across an immense span of time, destined to resolve in the ultimate triumph of Ahura Mazda. The individual human's moral responsibility was to choose the side of good, of truth, of Asher, the Zoroastrian term for cosmic order and righteousness, in that conflict. The Magi, the Zoroastrian priestly class, maintained the sacred fire temples that were the physical centers of Zoroastrian worship. Fire, as a representation of the divine light of Ahura Mazda, was treated with the highest reverence. Sacred fires burned continuously in the temples, tended by magi who wore masks over their mouths to prevent their breath from polluting the sacred flame. The magi also served as court ritual specialists, performing sacrifices, interpreting dreams, and providing the religious framework for royal decision-making. The physical experience of Zoroastrian religious practice was centered on the fire. At a fire temple in the Persian heartland, the sacred flame burned continuously in a stone or clay fire holder, maintained by magi who approached it only in a state of ritual purity. The magi wore white garments, and when tending the sacred fire, they wore a cloth covering over the lower part of their face, the padam, to prevent their breath from polluting the flame. Offerings to the fire consisted primarily of animal fat and fragrant wood. The sweet smell of the burning offering was understood as carrying the worshipper's devotion toward Ahura Mazda. The fire itself was not worshipped as a god. Zoroastrianism was emphatically monotheistic in its orientation toward Ahura Mazda, but was honored as the earthly representation of the divine light and as the medium through which communication between the human and divine realms was made possible. The Magi also maintained a complex ritual calendar, with specific observances tied to the seasons and to the Zoroastrian holy days. The spring festival of Nowruz, the New Year, falling at the spring equinox, was the most important festival in the Persian religious year, and it coincided with the tribute presentation ceremonies at Persepolis. The overlap between the religious New Year and the empire's annual demonstration of tributary loyalty was not accidental. The king stood at the intersection of cosmic and political order. Nowruz was the day when both were renewed simultaneously. In the book of Daniel, when the wise men of Babylon are called to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the text uses a word that later generations would recognize as referring to the Magi. And when the Magi appear at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, traveling from the east to find the infant Jesus, they are almost certainly understood as Persian Zoroastrian priestly figures, following astronomical signs that their tradition had trained them to interpret. But the deepest theological connection runs in a different direction. The Jewish communities that lived inside the Persian Empire for generations, in Babylon, in Susa, in Egypt, in the territories of what is now Iraq and Iran, were immersed in a sophisticated alternative theology that was wrestling with many of the same questions that Jewish thought was wrestling with. The nature of evil, the suffering of the righteous, what happens after death, the final destiny of the cosmos, the existence of malevolent spiritual beings opposed to the divine will. Zoroastrian theology had developed highly specific answers to all of these questions. The figure of Angra Mainyu, the cosmic adversary, the principle of deception, the enemy of truth, bears a structural resemblance to the development of the figure of Satan in Jewish literature of the post-exilic period. In the earlier Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew word Satan simply means adversary or accuser. It is a role, not a name, and the figure who plays it in Job and Zechariah is a member of the divine court, carrying out a legitimate function. By the period of Daniel and the books that followed it, the figure has become a named cosmic enemy, a specific being whose opposition to God and to God's people is cosmic in scope. Scholars have long noted the proximity of this development to the Zoroastrian figure of Angra Mainyu. Zoroastrianism also developed one of the earliest clear doctrines of bodily resurrection. The soul of the dead would be judged, and at the end of time, bodies would be reconstituted and the dead would rise to participate in the final renovation of the world. This idea, bodily resurrection, not merely the immortality of the soul, becomes prominent in Jewish texts of the Persian and subsequent periods, most explicitly in Daniel 12. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. This does not mean Zoroastrianism simply caused these developments in Jewish thought. Religious ideas develop from complex causes, and the Jewish theological tradition had its own internal logic and its own scriptural resources. But proximity matters. Ideas in the air of an intellectual and cultural environment matter. Jewish thinkers living and working inside an empire whose official theology was Zoroastrianism, attending the same markets and administrative offices as Zoroastrian priests, hearing the same theological arguments in a multi-ethnic urban environment. These thinkers were responding to a theological world in which Zoroastrian ideas were present, sophisticated, and powerful. Understanding this does not diminish the originality of post-exilic Jewish theology. It places it in its historical context, and that context is Persian. The Jewish community inside the Persian Empire was not a uniform population patiently waiting for return to the Promised Land. It was a diverse, geographically dispersed, socially varied community navigating the full complexity of life inside a multi-ethnic empire. Cyrus's decree, recorded in Ezra 1, invited any Jew who wished to return to Jerusalem to do so, and provided that the surrounding Persian community should support the returning Jews with silver, gold, goods, livestock, and free will offerings for the temple. The Ezra narrative records the return of approximately 42,360 people in the first wave, plus their servants, bringing with them the temple vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem. 42,000 people represents a significant community. It also represents a fraction of the Jewish population that was living in Babylonia and the broader Persian Empire at the time of the decree. Population estimates for the Jewish exile community in Babylon range from several hundred thousand to substantially more, depending on how the demographic evidence of the intervening generations is calculated. Many of those families had been in Babylonia since 586 BCE. 2 generations, in some cases nearly 3. They had built houses, established businesses, learned Babylonian scribal traditions, acquired Babylonian names alongside their Hebrew names, and married into the surrounding community. For many of them, the idea of returning to a Jerusalem they had never seen, a land of which they had only inherited stories, was not immediately compelling. The Elephantine papyri are the most direct window into the reality of Jews who did not return. Elephantine is an island in the Nile River at modern Aswan in southern Egypt. In the 5th century BCE, it was the site of a Persian military garrison at Egypt's southern frontier. Among the garrison troops were Jewish soldiers, a Jewish military colony that had been in Egypt for generations, perhaps predating the Persian period altogether. These Jews maintained their own temple to their god, Yahweh, a form of the divine name, at Elephantine. They performed their own sacrifices. They sent letters to the Persian governor of Judah and to the high priest in Jerusalem when they needed help. They entered into business partnerships and property agreements with their Egyptian and Aramean neighbors. They lent money at interest. They owned slaves. One remarkable Elephantine document is a marriage contract between a Jewish woman named Mibtahiah and her Egyptian husband. The contract is written in Aramaic and follows the standard legal form of Persian period contracts, with witnesses, authentication seals, and provisions for property division if the marriage dissolves. Mibtahaya's father, a prominent Jewish official in the Elephantine community, gives her rights in the marriage contract that go beyond what many contemporary legal systems offered women. She can initiate divorce proceedings, she retains specific property rights, she is documented as a property owner in her own right. These were not marginal people living in anxious exile. They were active participants in the Persian imperial economy and military system, with the legal standing, the commercial relationships, and the social integration that participation required. And back in Susa, some Jews reached significantly higher. Mordecai, described in Esther as sitting in the king's gate, occupied an administrative position in the Persian court. The king's gate in Persian palace complexes was not simply a doorway, it was an administrative complex where court officials transacted business, where petitions were received, where the formal machinery of access to royal authority operated. Mordecai's presence there implied official standing. He was not a supplicant waiting at the entrance. He was a functionary of the court, with regular access to the palace's administrative processes. Nehemiah's position as royal cupbearer was even more significant. The cupbearer's role, tasting the king's food and wine before the king consumed them, serving as protection against poisoning, required a level of personal trust in the cupbearer that was extraordinary. The cupbearer was among the very few individuals with regular, private, face-to-face access to the king's person. The emotional observation that the king made when Nehemiah appeared before him with visible sorrow on his face. "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick?" This is nothing but sadness of the heart, reflects the intimacy of the relationship between a king and the individual who regularly and literally handed him his wine. The debates recorded in Ezra and Nehemiah about intermarriage and communal boundaries are not abstract theological disagreements. They are arguments about communal survival inside an empire that was integrated enough, economically and socially, that maintaining a distinct Jewish identity required deliberate effort. The leadership around Ezra and Nehemiah, who pressed for separation from non-Jewish neighbors, were not simply being xenophobic. They were trying to prevent the gradual dissolution of a community that had already lost most of its members to integration, that had seen its homeland destroyed and its temple burned, and that was navigating a cosmopolitan imperial environment that offered every incentive to assimilate and very few practical penalties for doing so. The religious practice of Jewish communities in the diaspora during the Persian period was shaped by necessity. Without a temple, the central institutions of Jewish worship, animal sacrifice, the priesthood's ritual functions, the great festivals tied to the agricultural calendar of the land of Israel, could not be practiced in their traditional forms. The exile had forced a theological renegotiation. What did Jewish faith look like when the temple was absent and the land was inaccessible? The answer that emerged during the Babylonian exile and continued to develop in the Persian period was the proto-synagogue, a gathering place for prayer, Torah reading, and communal instruction that required neither a temple nor a priesthood for its basic functions. The word synagogue itself does not appear in the Hebrew Bible, but the practice it describes, communities gathering for the reading and interpretation of Scripture, almost certainly began during the exile. Ezekiel's description of gatherings at his house during the Babylonian period points toward this development. The elaborate public Torah reading ceremony described in Nehemiah 8, where Ezra reads from a wooden platform to a gathered crowd, and Levites interpret the text for those who cannot understand, describes a practice of communal scripture reading that was already established enough to be staged as a major public event. For the Jewish communities in the diaspora who did not return, these gatherings, wherever they met, in homes or in dedicated buildings, were the primary means of maintaining religious identity inside a cosmopolitan empire that made no demands about personal religious practice as long as political loyalty and tax compliance were maintained. The Persians did not require their Jewish subjects to worship Ahura Mazda, but neither did they provide or support Jewish religious infrastructure outside Judah. The maintenance of Jewish communal life in the diaspora was entirely the responsibility of the communities themselves. funded from their own resources, organized by their own leadership, and preserved through the deliberate cultural choice to remain distinct inside a world that offered constant and relatively comfortable alternatives. That choice was not cost-free. It required resisting patterns of social integration that the empire's cosmopolitan environment made easy and natural. It required teaching children a language, Hebrew, that was increasingly secondary to the Aramaic they heard in the market and used in their contracts. It required observing dietary restrictions and festival calendars in environments where these made you visibly different from your neighbors. It required, above all, maintaining a communal memory of events that many community members had not personally experienced, and a commitment to a covenant whose practical relevance in the absence of land, temple, and king had to be continually argued for and defended. The post-exilic community that produced the final form of much of the Hebrew Bible was a community engaged in exactly this argument. The biblical texts of the Persian period, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and the final form of many earlier books, are the documentary evidence of that argument, made in real time by people who had skin in the game. Now here is where the portrait of Persian tolerance has to be made more honest. The Cyrus cylinder, the famous clay document discovered in the ruins of Babylon in 1879 and now in the British Museum, is one of the most celebrated artifacts from the ancient world. It records Cyrus's policy of restoring displaced peoples to their homelands, returning cult statues to their temples, abolishing forced labor, and presenting himself as the chosen instrument of the Babylonian god Marduk, the deity who had rejected the previous king Nabonidus for his impiety and chosen Cyrus as a righteous replacement. This document is real. The policy it describes was real. It corresponds to what the Book of Ezra records, and it corresponds to what we know about how Cyrus treated conquered peoples more broadly. It was also a sophisticated piece of propaganda. The Cyrus cylinder was written in Babylonian cuneiform by Babylonian scribes in the theological language of Babylonian religion for a Babylonian audience. Its purpose was not to announce a general policy of human rights, a concept that had no equivalent in the ancient world, but to legitimate Persian rule in Babylon by presenting Cyrus as the chosen king of the Babylonian god Marduk. Every ruler in the ancient Near East who conquered a major city needed to demonstrate that the city's gods had chosen the conquest to happen. The Cyrus cylinder did this for Babylon with remarkable sophistication. Persian tolerance was real in the sense that it was meaningfully greater than what subject peoples had experienced under the Assyrian Empire, which had practiced systematic deportation, cultural erasure, and the forced adoption of Assyrian language and religion. Persian subject peoples were genuinely allowed to keep their gods, their languages, and significant elements of their legal and social traditions. But Persian tolerance ended at the point of political compliance. The Behistun inscription, the massive carved rock relief commissioned by Darius I in approximately 522 BCE, visible from the major road running through the Zagros Mountains, records in 3 languages what happened in Darius's first year of rule. Darius suppressed 19 revolts across the empire within a single year, as the Persian nobility and various subject peoples challenged the legitimacy of his succession. The inscription describes what happened to rebel leaders with an explicitness that Darius clearly intended: captured, subjected to public punishment, and executed as demonstrations of the consequences of rebellion. Babylon revolted twice in Darius's reign, once in 522 and once in 521 BCE. Both revolts were suppressed. After the second revolt, Darius dismantled Babylon's defensive walls and removed the statue of the Babylonian god Marduk. Egypt revolted under Xerxes in 486 BCE. Xerxes suppressed the revolt and downgraded Egypt's special status as a distinct satrapy with its own recognized gods and traditions, imposing harsher direct rule. The taxation burden deserves specific attention because it is easy to discuss in abstract terms: 14,500 talents of silver per year, without grasping what it meant for the family grinding their grain in the courtyard of a mud brick house in the Babylonian countryside. The tribute obligation of a satrapy was not divided evenly across its population. It flowed through layers of intermediate authority. The satrap imposed assessments on districts. District governors imposed them on villages. Village leaders imposed them on households. At each level, there was the possibility of additional extraction above the required amount. The farmer at the bottom of this hierarchy paid for all of it. Persian taxes were collected in kind as well as in silver. Grain, livestock, textiles, and labor were all forms of tribute that subject peoples could be required to provide. The Babylonian administrative archives of the Persian period document the operations of large agricultural estates and the commercial activities of families engaged in tax collection contracts. Tax farming, the practice of selling the right to collect taxes to private contractors who kept whatever they could collect above the contracted amount, was a significant feature of the Persian financial system, and it systematically transferred wealth from agricultural producers to commercial intermediaries. For ordinary people, meeting the annual tax obligation required having, at the right time, enough surplus production to satisfy the assessment after feeding the family. Families that could not meet the obligation faced the possibility of debt, of losing land, and in extreme cases, of falling into a form of debt bondage. It is this economic reality that underlies Nehemiah's anger in Nehemiah chapter 5, when he discovers that Jewish nobles and officials are charging interest on loans to their fellow Jews, who are mortgaging their fields and vineyards, and selling their children into debt bondage to pay Persian taxes. The economics Nehemiah confronts are not a literary invention. They are the documented normal operation of Persian period debt law, applied in a Jewish community, rebuilding its social order under the weight of imperial taxation. The Book of Esther's description of the danger of approaching the king unsummoned. If any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: all alike are to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, is not literary melodrama. It is an accurate description of the documented protocols surrounding the Persian royal person. The king's physical inaccessibility was not merely a matter of decorum, it was a mechanism of power, and its violation carried documented, real consequences. For the ordinary subject of the Persian Empire, Persian, Babylonian, Jewish, Egyptian, or any other nationality, the experience of imperial life was shaped by this combination: the genuine benefit of relative internal stability, maintained trade networks, and legal systems that actually functioned, alongside the constant background reality of living inside a system whose demands were non-negotiable and whose enforcement capacity was, ultimately, the largest military force in the world. The Persian royal court was the center of everything, and it was one of the most dangerous places in the ancient world to be. Access to the king was governed by protocols that had evolved over generations to protect the royal person from assassination, manage the flow of information and petition, and reinforce the symbolic distance between the king and everyone else. The royal bodyguard, the unit of Persian elite soldiers whom Herodotus calls the 10,000 immortals, so named because their numbers were always maintained at exactly 10,000, a fallen soldier immediately replaced, formed the outer physical perimeter of protection around the royal person. Inside that perimeter, a hierarchy of chamberlains, court officials, and personal attendants regulated every aspect of the king's daily interactions. The physical space of the inner court, the area most directly surrounding the king, was legally defined as a zone where presence without invitation was a capital offense. This was not hyperbole. Persian administrative practice included detailed regulations about who could enter which spaces within the palace complex, and unauthorized presence in the inner court was treated as an act with potentially treasonous implications. The assumption was simple: the only reason a person would approach the king without authorization was to harm him. The Persian king's daily life was itself a performance of control and power. The king did not eat alone. The royal meal was a ceremony involving dozens of attendants, each with a specific function. Food tasters confirmed the safety of dishes before they reached the king's hands. Servers of high rank presented the dishes in a prescribed order. The king ate in a section of the hall screened from direct view by a curtain, his personal consumption separated from the view of everyone else in the room, a practice that reinforced the symbolic distance between the royal person and all others. Even those dining in the royal presence were not truly dining with the king in any ordinary social sense. The royal schedule was structured around specific ritual obligations, daily prayers and offerings to Ahura Mazda, the formal reception of petitioners and officials at set times, military and administrative briefings from satrapal officials and royal inspectors, the management of the empire's correspondence, which was enormous. Persepolis and Susa generated and received thousands of documents per year, and the king was the apex of the system that produced them. The history of the Achaemenid dynasty confirms that the assumption behind the inner court protocols was not paranoid. Xerxes, almost certainly the king identified as Ahasuerus in the Book of Esther, was assassinated in his own bedchamber in 465 BCE. The ancient sources provide different accounts of exactly who did it. Ctesias, writing in the 4th century BCE with access to Persian court information, identifies the killer as Artabanus, the commander of the royal bodyguard, acting in conspiracy with the king's chamberlain. If this account is accurate, the men responsible for protecting the king's life were the men who ended it. Artaxerxes I, who came to power in the aftermath, was himself nearly killed in a coup in the early years of his reign. The Persian royal court was not merely a place of ceremony and power, it was a place where proximity to power was simultaneously the greatest advantage and the greatest risk available to any individual in the ancient world. The harem system, the institution at the center of Esther's story, was a physically enclosed and administratively managed component of the palace complex. Women who entered the royal household came under the administration of palace officials responsible for their maintenance, oversight, and presentation. The physical quarters of the royal harem were separated from the rest of the palace complex. Access was controlled by eunuch officials who managed the internal hierarchy and the logistics of the institution. Within the harem, a strict social hierarchy operated. The queen held the highest position, with formal rights and precedents that distinguished her from the other wives and concubines. Below her were the secondary wives, below them, the concubines, below them, the female attendants and workers who maintained the institution's daily operations. The Book of Esther describes the preparation process for the women selected to be presented to the king: 6 months of treatment with myrrh oil, 6 months with spices and cosmetics and other preparations. This description is consistent with what is known from other ancient Near Eastern sources about the elaborate preparation processes maintained for individuals entering royal service at the highest levels. The year of preparation was also, functionally, a year of complete separation from the world the women had previously known. A woman who entered the Persian royal harem and was not chosen as queen did not go home afterward. She remained in the palace complex, in the house of the concubines, for the rest of her life. Haman's use of the empire's administrative machinery as a weapon, obtaining a royal decree sealed with the king's own ring, dispatching letters through the royal courier system to all the satrapies, is a precise description of how the Persian imperial administration actually functioned. The king's seal authenticated documents. The royal postal system carried them to every corner of the empire. The satrapal administration was obligated to carry out royal decrees that arrived through official channels. What Haman did was use legitimate administrative tools for a catastrophic purpose. And it worked, precisely because the machinery was real and it functioned. Mordecai's counter-strategy, reaching Esther, Esther reaching the king issuing a second decree, exploited the same machinery. The counter-decree was not a retraction of the first decree. Persian administrative practice did not typically allow official decrees to be formally revoked. It was a new decree, issued through the same channels. allowing the Jews to defend themselves. Two competing royal decrees, both valid, both issued through official channels. The crisis this produced is a consequence of the Persian administrative system's own internal logic, applied to an existential threat. And Esther herself walked into the inner court. Read that sentence against everything you now know. She walked into the zone whose unauthorized entry was a capital offense. She walked toward a king who had removed his previous queen from her position. She walked into an institution where the political stakes of royal favor and royal displeasure were literally a matter of life and death, documented not as narrative drama, but as the normal operating reality of the Persian royal court. She walked in, and the king held out the golden scepter. Everything that has been described in this reconstruction, the palace on its terrace, the clay tablets measuring out 10 quarts of grain, the narrow streets of Susa, the cosmopolitan market, the sacred fire burning in the Magi's temple, the Jewish colony in Egypt writing letters in Aramaic, the royal court with its protocols and its dangers, all of this was the world in which the Persian period books of the Bible were written and lived. The decree of Cyrus that opens the book of Ezra was not an isolated act of divine intervention inserted into history from outside the normal workings of human empire. It was entirely consistent with documented Persian imperial policy for managing conquered populations, confirmed by the Cyrus Cylinder, motivated at least partly by the political logic of presenting the new Persian king as the legitimate heir of Babylonian religious and political authority. This does not make it less significant. The 50,000 Jews who walked out of Babylon toward Jerusalem were walking toward something real. The temple that Ezra and later Nehemiah worked to rebuild was a real building with real social, religious, and political stakes. The community that gathered to hear Ezra read the Torah in the public square of Jerusalem, described in Nehemiah 8 as standing from dawn until midday, weeping as the words were read and interpreted, was a real community, processing the weight of its own history in the open air of a city that their grandparents had been deported from. Nehemiah was a product of the Persian administrative system. His emotional intelligence, his political acumen, his understanding of when to be transparent with the king and when to assess the situation privately before speaking, all of this reflects the practical wisdom of someone who had spent years navigating the most complex and dangerous political environment in the ancient world. When he rose in the night and rode around Jerusalem's walls without telling anyone his purpose, he was doing exactly what a skilled Persian administrator would do, completing his assessment before committing to a proposal he was not yet certain he could defend. The theological developments that emerged from the Jewish communities living inside the Persian Empire, the more developed monotheism that emerged from confrontation with Zoroastrian dualism, the angelology that became more specific and more elaborated, the eschatological framework that projected the arc of history toward a divine resolution, were not produced in a vacuum. They were the intellectual and spiritual work of real people, navigating real questions inside a specific historical environment that we can reconstruct. The Persian Empire fell to Alexander the Great in 330 BCE. Persepolis was burned. The treasury was looted. The last Achaemenid king, Darius III, was killed by his own officers. The 200-year empire that had shaped the biblical world from Cyrus to Artaxerxes came to an end, and a new Greek-speaking world began to form around the ruins. But the Jewish community that had been shaped by the Persian period did not disappear with the empire. The texts they had written, the theology they had developed, the communal practices they had established, and the identity they had maintained against the absorptive pressure of the world's most cosmopolitan empire, all of this survived. The proto-synagogue became the synagogue. The Aramaic-inflected Hebrew of the Persian period became the Hebrew in which scripture continued to be copied, taught, and interpreted. The theological ideas that had crystallized in proximity to Zoroastrian thought became the common inheritance of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Understanding the Persian world is not a threat to the faith that these texts have sustained across 2.5 millennia. It is a deepening of it. The people who produced these texts were not writing mythology or inventing history, they were processing, in the forms available to them, prophecy, narrative, legal code, poetry, prayer, the experience of living inside the world's first superpower, holding on to an identity and a covenant that the world's most powerful administrative machinery had no interest in preserving. They held on. The question that the Persian world leaves us with, reading these texts from the outside of the empire they describe, is whether we understand with sufficient clarity what it actually cost to be the people who wrote these words, and whether that understanding changes how seriously we take what they wrote. End of script.nt that we can reconstruct. Understanding that environment is not a threat to the faith that these texts have sustained across 2.5 millennia. It is a deepening of it. The people who produced these texts were not writing mythology or inventing history. They were processing, in the forms available to them, prophecy, narrative, legal code, poetry, prayer, the experience of living inside the world's first superpower, holding on to an identity and a covenant that the world's most powerful administrative machinery had no interest in preserving. They held on. The question that the Persian world leaves us with, reading these texts from the outside of the empire they describe, is not whether the history is accurate or the theology is coherent. The question is whether we understand, with sufficient clarity, what it actually cost to be the people who wrote these words, and whether that understanding changes how seriously we take what they wrote.